So, first of all, let me just introduce myself. Mark Patel, Senior Partner with McKinsey. I'm one of the leaders in our sustainability practice overall. I also take the lead on our work in carbon removals. And in that role, I am the McKinsey representative for our work in Frontier as well. So I'm one of the members of the founding board at Frontier too. So as a firm, we're engaged in our own activities for carbon removal, but we're also very engaged in the community around carbon removal in our client service and in a broader environment as well. So I'm delighted to be here. I love talking about carbon removals, so I'm delighted to be with each of you. It's great to have Joe, Jamie, and Pat here. Can I actually ask, instead of me introducing each of you, do you mind if I ask you to introduce yourselves? And the reason for that is you know yourselves better than I do you. So I think it would be great if you don't mind introducing yourself, where you're coming from and what you do, but also just a little bit about what that means in the world and why it's important.
Sounds good. I guess I'll start. So thank you for having me here. I'm Joe Kochanski, the head of operations for Puro Earth in the Americas. We are a carbon crediting program, standard carbon removal registry that is the first to be ICVCM endorsed. I've been working in sustainability for about the last 15 years in different capacities, mostly in certification and verification services. Came over to Puro last year in April and have just been kind of overseeing the office here now in the Americas.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Jamie.
Hello, my name is Jamie Bakos. I'm a professional environmental engineer. My claim to fame is I graduated from the first accredited environmental engineering as a pure engineering program in Canada, so I'm very technical, so sorry about this preview. For over 30 years, I've spent my career really focusing on how to turn waste biomass into something more valuable in what is now called the circular economy, and I still do it, and we focus on producing biochar in Saskatchewan, Canada.
My name's Pat Jones. I work with Clean Maine Carbon. We started the project about 4 years ago. It was combined at the time with a biomass power plant. My background is in power mostly, a lot of biomass power and a lot of combined cycle gas-fired power plants. My role was business development all over Canada, actually US, Australia, and I did a small project in Africa. I got involved in this project about 4 years ago, and we have a small group of investors, about half of them are from Maine, and they kept with this thing through all the ups and downs, and we just started our biochar facility up in July this past year, this past July, so we're excited about the future.
Excellent. Thank you all. In most rooms like this, I say, can we have a show of hands to see who knows what carbon removals are? I suspect, great, thank you. Thank you for the show of hands, but I expect to see every hand up. If you don't, then you can pretend that you know it. But maybe just a couple of words. Carbon removals, what are we talking about and why? And let's put it into a few numbers. So, globally, we all probably know the scale that we need to talk about. Gigatons of CO2 and CO2 removal, CO2 equivalent removal in the next decade in order to be able to achieve anything like the goals that we have for both the end of this decade and in the next 25 years. The challenge, of course, is how you even contemplate not just the reductions in emissions, but what we think about as the absolute removal of CO2. And if we look at where we're at today, the progress against, call it the 10 gigaton target is really in the less than 0.1%. And what that means is the scaling, and that's where we're going to spend a lot of time as a panel, the scaling requirements are massive. Now, we talk about that in terms of what's the required growth rate. From a base of such a low number, we need growth rates that are 50, 100 times. But what we also need is legitimate projects that are going to deliver that scale. And those projects to deliver carbon removals come in a few different shapes and forms. We talk about nature-based removals, the fundamental programs that achieve afforestation, reforestation, that give us the models for soil-based carbon sequestration. These are fundamental to scale. The second category is around technology-driven removals. And I think we're all now becoming much more familiar with at least the early stages of direct air capture, of other mechanical, physical, chemical, and biological forms that come in an engineered fashion. And we're also going to talk today about some of the hybrids, right? We're going to talk about biochar today, building materials that basically go back to using wood, and other models where we see both on land and in ocean scale in which we can achieve a well-defined and programmatic approach to carbon removal, but that also has to take into account the mechanisms and the mechanics of nature. So we'll talk about all of that a little bit today. Now, where are we at a global level in terms of building momentum around this? Well, first of all, my show of hands question was a bit of a start, right? Do people even know what removals are and why they're important? Outside of this room, maybe not so much. In New York, at least this week, hopefully, but there's a planetary challenge around educating both the industrial economy, the capitalist economies, and the markets around why removals have value and what it's going to take to create a removals market that continues to communicate and to place value. Now, beyond that, there's also what we see happening in the public sector. The good news is in the United States, we have both policy and we have support in the form of tax credit, subsidy, investment loans, all of which are helping to create a framework for carbon removals. In Europe, we see the same, and around other parts of the world, we certainly see momentum around it. We also have a voluntary market. In some respects, a voluntary market is a strange concept, right? It's the idea that it's actually of value and important for actors who wouldn't otherwise be motivated to do it outside of their regulatory burden or outside of their business interests. But we do have a voluntary market already that has established a basis for carbon removal, and as we all know, the curve is only going to get steeper by the end of this decade. The companies, the organizations, the institutions that have signed up for voluntary targets are on a path where they will migrate to higher quality, more removal-based mechanisms by the end of this decade and certainly into the next. So these are all important. And then we have other mechanisms. I mentioned frontiers. Show of hands for anyone who knows what frontier is. Okay, that's a pretty good show of hands too. So, you know, the concept of the advanced market commitment of both private and public organizations coming together, making the stance that they're willing to pay a premium in order to advance the availability of removals, and creating another market mechanism for it, that's a great positive step as well. And we see it happening through Frontier, but we'll also see it happening through other mechanisms as well. So there are a couple of questions that remain. First of all, how can we scale these technologies? We'll spend time talking about that in a moment. And then secondly, how can we bring them to a cost-effective point? How do we work down the cost curve as quickly as possible? Because the best and most consistent mechanism for creating scale is to create something that is at an attractive price and that is consistently delivering against cost. So that's why we wanted to talk about those topics today. It's also why we've got such a great panel to do that. I think we've got both the folks who know the markets well and have been very active in the markets, and those who are both delivering against the science and creating the projects. So I'm very excited for the panel that we have. And I thought, why don't we start, if that's all right with you, Joe, with Puro Earth. You're the first carbon standard to focus exclusively on carbon removals. Can you say a little bit more? I know you introduced yourself, but can you say a little bit more about the company's journey? And also, why the decision to focus exclusively on carbon removals?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Mark. So yeah, Puro Earth has been around since the concept was devised in 2018, and the company was founded in 2019, so very young. I don't think anybody was, or not very many people were talking about carbon removal at that point. So our co-founders, Antti and Mariana, basically had the idea and went and got it incubated. At that point in time, the investor liked it. So we had initially some auctions with some corporate buyers that showed interest. Microsoft ended up being one of the early buyers of carbon removals that were verified under Puro. And then it just kept kind of gaining momentum, I would say. NASDAQ became our majority shareholder in 2021. And yeah, we've just had several first of their kind methodologies that ended up kind of working their way through the system. We've now kind of gone through this ICROA endorsement process, full speed ahead with the ICVCM core carbon principles and the assessment framework. CORSIA is coming up in submitting our application next year. So all of these different quality benchmarks to show that what the offering is legit and robust. And yeah, I guess what else can I say about it?
Just to pick up on one thing, so why does NASDAQ care? Why is it important to NASDAQ?
So I would say NASDAQ is sort of doubling down on their ESG offerings. They've done some various investments. There's a company called Metrio that does carbon accounting. They have one report that's related to kind of submitting your kind of ESG report. A relatively easy way to do that. And then of course Puro. So I think they were probably just picking up on the opportunity as well, that this is something needed. The listed companies and beyond could find value in carbon removals.
That's great. Jamie, just to come to talk a little bit about what you've been doing in your experience, how has your journey in carbon removal sort of reflected the challenges of scaling, and what do you see as the requirements to scale?
Well, I think for me it all comes down to initially we really looked at it from a waste perspective. We're really trying to go for zero waste, take waste out of landfills and turn it into something useful.
I think we lost your mic there. You might. Yeah, if you want to yell.
I don't have, sorry. I don't have PTSD, I have TSD, like it's still going on. So full traumatic stress syndrome from, how do you scale? But essentially, to me, it's all about the markets. So where's that carbon gonna go? So carbon for biochar has use in soil applications. It's used to entrain nutrients and moisture, and it's a nice home for microorganisms. But there's also many, many uses of carbon. We develop activated carbon products for water purification and odor control. We work with the plastic side of things. So really, how do we scale is I want to know where that carbon's going to go. So I think what's so wonderful about the voluntary carbon markets and the carbon markets, it really offers an opportunity where we can dive into different markets that may not have as high value proposition. So we don't have to get $2 a pound for the carbon. We can get a lower amount and really deliver that carbon into the agriculture sector and other sectors that don't necessarily know what to do with it. It might be a challenging move to be able to apply the carbon in different markets. So it's going to take a lot more energy and effort. In that case, the price point goes down, and we can use the voluntary markets to cover those costs. But to me, how we scale really is about where the carbon's going to go and how big are those markets. So right now we're looking at, in the US, I'm guessing around 50,000 tons a year of biochar, maybe 100, maybe another 100 worldwide. The market for activated carbon, which is typically made from coal, is at least 5 times, 6 times that, and value-wise, it's at least 10 times. You have carbon going into everybody that drives a car. Plastic components of your car, the tires, all have carbon black. Carbon is carbon. Carbon can be used in some cases as an alternative for carbon black, which is 15 million tons. We're looking at it for concrete. So concrete is 4 trillion tons a year. If we could add 1% of biocarbon in concrete, well, that's 40 million tons of carbon. So there's where we scale, and it's all based on where that carbon is going to go. And voluntary carbon markets will help open up additional markets that may not be ready for the value proposition.
You mentioned, I'm just going to pick on, we're going to talk about it in quite a bit of detail, but since both of you are engaged around biochar, maybe just a minute of education for those that don't know. What's biochar? How should we think about biochar in this world of carbon removal?
Sure. Biochar is essentially you take let's take wood or straw from agriculture. And so what you do is you heat it without oxygen. And the key point is you heat it very hot. So you have to get a temperature of more than 1,000 degrees typically, so high heat. So that's more than 500 degrees Celsius for all the Europeans and Canadians in the room. And so what happens when you heat it without oxygen, you actually drive off all the liquids and the moisture and everything else, the oxygen in there, and you're left with pure solid carbon. And the difference is we're all familiar with campfires and we've seen burning logs and unfortunately forest fires. What happens in that case, you have oxygen. So the wood will actually 99.5% of it will actually go back to carbon dioxide and water, and you're left with a tiny little bit of white ash. When you don't have the oxygen, you can't complete fire. So you actually don't burn it. You're actually more like cooking it. And so if you have a log and you burn it, you're going to end up tiny little bit of ash. If you have pyrolysis and you don't have oxygen, you're going to end up with actually quite a bit of carbon. It's going to be very light, but you're going to drive off everything but the pure carbon that's in there, and you've now have a stable form of carbon that's quite inert and is going to be there for quite a long time.
And the translation from biochar into, you talked about carbon black and going into products. Help us with that. What's the steps?
Well, biocarbon or biochar is black. So carbon black is a different substance. It's made from fossil fuel. And there's many, I think we also have to understand that carbon exists in many, it looks exactly the same, but it may act very, very different. So in many cases, carbon black is just meant for a pigment or UV protection or a stabilizer for stiffness. Biochar, biocarbon, can do the same thing, but not in every single application, because carbon, if it's heated at 900 degrees, is a very different carbon than if it was heated at 500 degrees. Carbon black is produced in a similar way through pyrolysis, but it's different particle size, different surface area, different morphology, so very technical stuff. But biocarbon can replace a lot of those coal-based carbons that are used today in steel, plastics, even graphene oxide production, things like that.
I'm going to come back in a minute as we go through the questions to talk a bit more about what does it mean in terms of how long we can store carbon in these different forms and what that takes and why that's important from a carbon market perspective. But let me first of all come to you, Pat. So I'm actually just going to come back a little bit to your intro. So you mentioned you'd been in energy before you got into what's now more on the removals side. Talk to us about what's it been like to go through that arc? What's the difference between what you were doing before in terms of how the industry works versus now selling into a market that's relying on credits and on voluntary markets in order to make it a real thing?
Yeah, I think one of the big things back in the power business, especially the independent power days, is you got a contract from a utility. You had a contractor that gave you a guaranteed startup date, guarantees on production and efficiencies. And so you could do non-recourse financing, and the projects were big. They were, the last one was 1,000 megawatts, $800 million. So it attracted lots of opportunities, insurance companies to finance it, all kinds of different things. This project, which we started about 4 years ago. It was associated with a biomass power plant that, as I said, didn't happen, but it's small relatively. So you don't get the financial interest, or you haven't gotten the financial interest that you would have had from, a independent power project with great credit, on the other side of it. So it's taken a long time to put the pieces together, and actually the main investors stepped out in front of the truck and put a bunch of equity into it, guaranteed some loans, because one of the things that happened to me a lot was you go out to see who wants to buy the biochar. Send me a sample, send me lab test. You go to Puro Earth, you need to be able to do life cycle assessment. You really need to be there, and the risk capital to get you from zero to there because of all the other unknowns. What does biochar sell for? Is it agriculture, concrete additives, landscape, hardscape, So it's a very difficult thing, and our goal is, next step is to increase the number of facilities on site, the opportunity to do that, and the cost to do it is less than the first plant significantly. And then another phase of it is to integrate those facilities with a biomass power plant. So that's kind of our longer term goal of how to get bigger in the market, but we just felt that we had to take a step on our own to show people what it looks like to see a plant.
Yep. Back to Jamie for a minute. This theme of what does it take to get going? What have been the greatest challenges for you in building a business?
It really comes back to it does come back to the markets for me. I mean, you have to find a buyer, and then so really we have all the feedstock. There's more than 1 billion tons of, like a gigaton of biomass waste in North America. I mean, the waste is not the problem. The technology, it took a while to figure out, to make it autothermal, to not use any fossil energy in the process, to be the most efficient conversion, to capture the most carbon. So that took a while, but actually, you know, when like us and other producers and the academic community really focused on biochar for soil, but there really was no market for it. There was no market pull. Nobody knew what it was, what to do with it, how it works, why they would even use it. So it was a challenge that the market challenge was the biggest one, because we could produce it, but we actually didn't have any buyers. So that's when we kind of moved. We took a little bit wider, broader look at the larger carbon picture. You know, biochar is not every carbon. So carbon is used everywhere in more than 24 applications. So let's try to figure out where we can take the biocarbon, you know, replace coal-based carbon or oil-based carbon, and put it into products as well. And also to make sure that it's not going to be burned as well. Yeah. You know, we have to follow that route. Whether we can get credit or not, we want to make sure that we don't want that carbon to go back to the atmosphere. That's critical. But we need homes for the carbon, you know. And it could be in every building now. It could be in every car. You know, it could be everywhere. It could be used to purify water worldwide. And you know, we have those forever chemicals. That's a big market and growing for activated carbon. So we could use biocarbon for that. There's no reason we can't, you know, attack that marketplace. So, sorry, I forgot the question again.
Challenges. Yeah. What's really hard? What's the?
Yeah, it's really the honestly, that's it. That's the hardest one is figuring out where that carbon is going to go. And once you know that, your business model is pretty much complete.
So once you've figured it out, the application side of it, the customer side of it, is it about really finding the unlock with them, or is it also about helping them to go build their business around it?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, we've been working on developing business in the Middle East, in Dubai. So I'm on calls. It's 14-hour time difference, so I'm on at 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning. So 4 a.m. call is with somebody that's in agriculture, and they have greenhouses, and they're growing, you know, tomatoes and plants. And so we got connected through a business, you know, connection agency, you know. And the lady is, you know, what is biochar? What does it look like? What do I do with it? You know, why would I do anything with it? You know, and she's in agriculture, and you know, you try to explain, okay, well, it's going to retain the nutrients, the moisture, and it's great, you know, but there's no actual track record. I mean, the ancient Amazonians used it like 3,000 years ago, and it's still in those soils, but you know, there's not a lot of descendants in you know, working on that. My next call was with an activated carbon company, and they have they take biochar that's been altered, tweaked to enhance the surface area from, say, 1 square meter per gram to 1,000 square, and that's why it's so effective in taking out pollutants out of water. And biochar is not that, you know, specifically effective. So they fill these vessels with activated carbon. Water purification is big in the Middle East, and you know, the conversation was, okay, do you have an 8x30 mesh with an iodine number of about 800 or greater than 800 with, you know, an apparent density of 0.4? And it's like, yes, we do. Here's the spec sheet, you know, and then you provide the technical data sheet, the SDS, you send them a sample, and we actually were doing business. But the sales cycle with the very lovely lady from this amazing farm in the middle of the desert. It's all green and it's all organic and it's wonderful, but to actually sell the product or even give it away to that customer is a challenge. And you got to think about how much time you want to spend during the day to convince people to use something they're not familiar with. So anyway, the second fellow is very familiar with the product and ready to purchase.
What's maybe this is a question for each of you. How important has the development of the carbon credit and carbon credit market been for you to be able to develop the business? Has it, like in what you're describing, for example, Jamie, you're selling a product, but you're also augmenting your business model. How do you see that developing over time?
Well, carbon credit revenue has not been a part of it at all. That's actually why we went away towards more higher value applications. So we can remove a ton of carbon from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, for about $260 per metric ton. We typically sell our product for between $600 and $800 per metric ton equivalent. So there's a profit margin there. Now, I don't know why I'm forgetting the question again. Sorry about this.
I was saying, how important is a carbon market to support your business?
Well, I'm absolutely floored by the opportunity. It's an amazing change. Like, venture capital is really, it's difficult. They don't necessarily see the opportunity for the scale. They see it more project-based, more niche-based. So you're not going to get a lot of venture capital dollars in typically. So you've now arranged this entirely roundabout finance mechanism that didn't exist before a couple years ago. So it's tremendously exciting to see an alternative form of essentially financing to allow us to progress and actually make sure we're moving carbon. We're not just producing it, but we're moving it out the door to the customers. So that's the difference. And whether the VCs ever really jump on wholeheartedly or not, maybe it's not even needed. I mean, these are good, solid projects that make, that make sense from an economic and an environmental perspective. So yeah, it's tremendously exciting. We have yet to realize that sort of push in our progress and growth, but it's definitely exciting, and I'm just floored by it. I think it's going to be phenomenal.
So
Please, yeah, go ahead, please.
Comment. So you have to keep in mind that biochar, the people that were producing biochar even 10 years ago or 5 years ago, it was kind of a very niche, hippie, organic farming type situation, very small scale. I don't know how else to describe it, because that is the sort of community. If you go to a biochar conference, that's not these guys necessarily, but they know what I'm talking about. So that's been one issue, is the scale. So small,
Yeah.
and thus, if you're using biochar for water filtration or something, you might be expecting $2,000 a ton for the physical product. But because there's all this supply coming online, the economics of that no longer work. So if you're a small scale producer, at the end of the day, you're going to be potentially going out of business without carbon finance. The other thing is that what we see with biochar producers, basically, because the industrial agriculture farmers haven't picked up on this yet, even though it's a perfect application in places like California and whatnot, where there's drought, they have all this abundant use of fertilizers and other things that are fossil-based going on. The prices of those have gone up. So there really is a great opportunity for them, but it's a conservative industry, and they take a while to kind of come around. So sometimes people will ask about, why does a cork, a CO2 removal certificate, cost $150 or $200 a ton for biochar? Well, because basically they can't make the same revenue on selling the physical product anymore, and there's not really the buyers. So the most successful cases that we see, the people are giving it away for free if possible, or putting it onto their own land if they're able to do that. Not everyone can. But yeah, that is the delta right there. That's where this is coming around.
Where the market's stepping in, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's very helpful. I want to come back to kind of what's the Puro Earth sort of therefore outlook on it, but maybe just to come back to Pat for a second. I mean, because we were on this question of what's the role of the carbon markets to essentially support a business model for you? How does that play out for your particular business?
Well, any support is welcome and needed because of what Joe just said, and Jamie, you know, the adoption of biochar by a farmer or by an agricultural process well, I've never put it on. I don't know many other farmers that are putting it on, so why am I going to do it? Fortunately, the USDA and NRCS, National Resource Conservation Service, has come out with some funds to give to farmers, grants, so that they can buy the biochar and apply it to the fields. And we've been fortunate enough to get a few farmers who are going to do that because they got no cost in it, so they can read the literature, they can understand it, they're a bit more progressive. So that helps us in that particular instance. But without carbon credits, I don't think we would have ever started up, because that gave a glimmer of hope. You know, at the end of the tunnel, there's some light that there is a market for some credits. That must mean there's some other things. So it all played together. So state, federal, carbon credits, and ultimately leading to a vibrant market is going to be critical.
Yeah. And for your business in particular, how much of a difference is it making? Like,
How much what?
how important is it to your business in particular? Like the viability?
It's extremely important
Yeah.
right now. Absolutely, and it will be, because I think that to get things to scale up, the prices of the product have to come down.
Yeah.
So there's a balance in there, and I don't think you're going to find 5-10 years from now the credits and or the support from federal and or state governments are going to be there. The state of Maine has been extremely supportive of this. It's the most heavily forested state in the country.
Yep.
Paper mills are shutting down. You know, there's just wood products are going away, and so they're looking at it as, you know, we got to avoid forest fires. There's all kinds of interaction that go on with regard to biochar, but absolutely carbon credits are critical to making it successful.
So maybe, Joe, back to you. Help us understand how we should think about how credits are evolving, right? We've had significant volume of credits retiring now. We need to understand the permanency of different mechanisms for carbon removal. How do you see, and how do you help other folks understand what does it mean when we talk about somewhat permanent, fully permanent? How to think about that in terms of how it prices? Well, you're obviously playing an important role there.
Yeah, I see Gabriella Walker here in the audience, and I'm sorry to call you out, but just I know you. This word permanence and whatnot too is kind of you know, not the preferred nomenclature in many ways, because there's nothing that is sort of this permanent. Maybe with enhanced rock weathering that you have this going on, but yeah, we look at it in different, you know, phases of durability, if you will. And the science is kind of coming along. So that's how the Puro standard is evolving as well. Is basically, if the science is there, then like for biochar in particular, a lot of people want to try and make the claim that it would be 1,000 years. And most likely there is going to be something there at 1,000 years. The reason they want to do that is because of, you know, Frontier, for example, having that requirement, First Movers Coalition, and others as well. So there's a strong incentive. We do see a pathway actually on that front, just to like put it into building materials. If you have no degradation going on, or for example, you know, there are some people that are pumping this underground into geologic storage sites. So that's another opportunity where you can most likely provide enough evidence to get to that point. But at the end of the day, even if it is 100 years or hundreds of years, that is still so relevant to what the issue is. And so as far as we, you know, even with the nature-based solutions, that's everything is going to be helpful in what we're dealing with here. But yeah, I think, you know, actually we have set the 100-year minimum for our particular standard. So that was sort of a new thing at the beginning of or at the end of last year. And
what effect did that have? When you set the 100-year minimum, did that reshape how you thought about the what's out there and the portfolio of what's possible, or was it fairly easy to adopt?
It ended up being reasonably easy. I think a lot of people were excited about it. It was unprecedented to that point. We did have to drop a couple. We had a pilot methodology for soil carbon that was dropped. We had a bio-based construction material, sort of cork, that was also dropped at 20 and 50 years. And yeah, it's, you know, there's nothing wrong with soil carbon or anything, but if the risk of reversal at 20 years or whatnot, that could be quite an issue.
How did you decide that the 100 years was the right point?
I believe that was based on sort of IPCC, sort of UN setting that as the number.
Yep. Maybe just a couple of more open questions, because I want to just also give you the chance to share your broader perspectives. If you were talking to, as you are, an audience that's made up of both investors, folks who are influencing policy, folks who are also engaging from a business perspective and from a science perspective, what are the things that either you've learned in the journey so far or that you would like to see different for how we move forward, that you think would make the greatest difference here in terms of both adoption and scaling? And maybe I'll start with you, Pat.
I'll go back to what Jamie said. I think that the ultimate sale of the product or use of the product is going to be critical. We can't rely on government tax credits or government subsidies or entities that want to go do some good environmental things. We need to be able to get the product, and so it's going to have some time for people, whether it's farmers or Cornell did studies on concrete. They didn't work out so well. Did it affect the structural capabilities of concrete? We got to get by all that stuff so that you can have a vibrant market that then becomes more based on just what the market capabilities are.
Do you feel that you're still on the margin of, like you talk about concrete, for example, very mainstream industry, something that's very well established, lots of industry standards around how it's applied in construction. When you talk to an industry like that, are you talking to an industry that's informed and already thinking about how to incorporate this, or is it still early?
My opinion, every one of them is early. Everybody we speak to, so you have to find people that are a bit more progressive. But I was talking with a gentleman who was involved in the carbon market, biochar market, and they're building some anodes for the aluminum industry, and the response back was, that improves it and reduces our emissions and everything else. But right now, we don't have to do that to make our product, and we're not going to spend the money. You get that in contrast to, say, farmers who are not necessarily the most progressive. So to break those barriers in all those industries is going to be difficult, but doable. And once you get one, and I hope there's somebody out there that says we're going to put it in our concrete or our mix because it's a good thing to do for the environment and be able to market it, then other entities that they compete against will have to follow down that trail.
Yeah. And my question was a bit of a leading one, because what you just characterized appears to be both the challenge and the opportunity in so many applications, which is that there can be functional benefit, performance benefit, cost benefits, but there is inertia in so many sectors around why we would adopt something different, and there's structural challenges to why folks would even consider it, like standards and like market mechanisms that are built against adopting new alternatives. And I think that's one of the challenges we have here. We're seeing opportunity, but we have significant barriers to break down oftentimes to get folks to actually be able to engage. Yeah. Jamie, what would be your thoughts and advice?
Well, I'd like people to really see the beauty of biochar, actually. What's so cool about it is you're recovering a tremendous amount of carbon from the atmosphere, and then you have a useful product that is stable, that we talk about permanence of. I mean, if there's still charcoal in the Amazon basin 3,000 years later, 10% of the soils, Dr. Johan Lehman from Cornell has validated this, been on the cover of Nature. I mean, I don't think it's 100 years, but I mean, if you produce carbon at a lower temperature, for example, you'll get degradation, but a higher temperature, you're going to get really stable. I mean, you could go up to graphite. You could make diamonds out of carbon, so diamonds are pretty stable. But so I like to, I think it's really the low-hanging fruit. There's so much waste out there in the forestry waste and food waste and in agriculture. It's unbelievable. So let's process it. Like, take it out of the landfill or stop burning it. And now we can use the products to purify water. Like, how bad is that? Like, why should we bury it? Carbon should be a two-way street, okay? Like, we have to mitigate the amount of anthropogenic CO2, right? But carbon's going to keep going back and forth. We don't want the ocean to have to absorb it all, because that's going to change the plankton and the ocean life, right? So we want carbon to go in and carbon go back, and it has to be in balance. And biochar and pyrolysis is the actual tool that's available now. The feedstock's available now, and the product just needs a little bit. We need a little bit of sales and education, and maybe some government support. Maybe obviously the voluntary carbon markets. So that's what I want to understand. I'd like people to really understand. This is not going to solve all the problem. Like, you probably take care of 15% of global CO2 emissions, maybe 20 if we have purpose-grown biomass and pyrolyze it. But let's get on this. Every solution is going to be needed. I mean, we got to hit everything. But this is one thing Pat's just started up in July. I mean, let's keep this rolling. Let's keep expanding and get more carbon production from these materials. Like, why not?
Joe.
So yeah, I'll just kind of use a moment to just talk about. Well, I guess I'm not sure if I'm actually responding to your question or not, but
You can go off script.
couple of comments. Just being aware that there is a social justice element that needs to be taken into consideration. So that's at a community level. There are a lot of fellow environmentalists out there that are completely opposed to carbon removal. I was shocked to find that out because it was not intuitive for me to kind of, but yeah. So there are a lot of people that think it would be an excuse to just use fossil fuels forever. Unfortunately, it's not getting any help from the fossil fuel industry, who sometimes will be saying that straight up, that is our intention. But there are companies like McKinsey and others that are kind of demonstrating that it's not necessarily, that's not the intention, that they're still doing your best to reduce your emissions while sort of building up the capacity for a net zero future. And yeah, that's if there are buyers in this audience trying to just kind of do a stepwise approach, small amount because the prices are much higher, also realizing that it's not like the VCM that you're familiar with. The supply of high quality, durable carbon removals is very small. So you kind of need to build those relationships, and even small purchases will help these companies like this exist.
That's great. We're at time. First of all, I want to say my quote from the panel is, "Carbon is a two-way street." Thank you, Jamie. It's a good one. Pat, Joe, Jamie, thank you all very, very much. Thank you to everybody in the audience as well.